Viewers, this is Dr. Qamar Cheema, and I'm thrilled to have with me Mr. Brian Huey, who is a Taiwan-based analyst, and he writes for different global newspapers. Thank you very much, Mr. Brian, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So, Mr. Brian, the important discussion is obviously these days is about what's going on here in Taiwan, and we wanted to listen from you. So, how do you see the Chinese aggression on Taiwan, particularly when Nancy Pelosi's visit was there? So, do you think that can you explain our audience that was this something new, or this is coming from some time past? And if you can kindly explain us that why China is so aggressive when it comes to Taiwan.
Yeah, that's right. And so China claims Taiwan as part of its territory. The PRC has actually never controlled Taiwan in its history. The only time in which Taiwan was incorporated into China as a province was during the Qing dynasty, and that was only for 7 years. But the contemporary PRC claims to inherit the borders of the Qing Empire. And so Taiwan has been governed by the ROC since the KMT came over Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War. But because of that, because of these tensions are unresolved, then China still claims Taiwan. And so then the Pelosi visit, because of the fact that the U.S. is Taiwan's security guarantor in the event of a invasion from China, this is why this was considered provocative by China. And so China responded by conducting unprecedented live fire drills around Taiwan. These drills took place closer to Taiwan than during the third Taiwan Straits crisis. China also fired a missile that passed over Taipei, although technically the missile was more in outer space. And so it is clearly an attempt to show intimidation, though it technically was not really passing over Taipei in the sense of a kind of aerospace missile or that sort of thing. And so this is why there's a very strong response. But in general, in past years, one has observed this kind of ramping up of Chinese aggression towards Taiwan. For example, last year, around the time of Chinese National Day, which is commemorated on October 1st, China escalated its air incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone, the airspace around Taiwan, in which an aircraft identified itself for security purposes to near daily occasions, if not daily on many occasions. And so as a result, there has been this kind of escalation in general in the past few years.
So Brian, since you have explained us all this, what do you think that do the Taiwanese people really think that America will be guarantor of the Taiwanese security when in case the Chinese will attack or will show aggression?
It's a really good question because historically America has been committed to strategic ambiguity, not actually making clear what course of action it would take in the event of a Taiwan contingency. There have been calls now, for example, for strategic clarity from some voices, particularly Republicans in the U.S., hawkish on the issue of China. And so there's some people in Taiwan then that would actually welcome this, having a much firmer, more concrete U.S. commitment to Taiwan. But then I think particularly after the invasion of Ukraine, there's more discussion of what would actually happen in the event of an invasion of Taiwan. For example, in Ukraine, the U.S. did not get directly involved, provided arms to Ukraine, but didn't actually get involved itself. And so there's discussion, is that what the U.S. would do regarding Taiwan? And the U.S. has tried to reassure that its relation to Taiwan is different to its relation to Ukraine, that, for example, it has economic interests in Taiwan that does not have in Ukraine. For example, that's why you do have visits such as the Pelosi visit. But then I think some people would find that still unreassuring. They would not be reassured by that.
Hmm. So, Mr. Brian, how do you see that in case of an armed conflict, don't you think the Taiwanese people believe that because here in Pakistan and other parts of this region, we believe that when we talk about Taiwan, we talk about development, we talk about technology, we talk about, let's say, growth. So, don't you think that in case of any armed conflict, Taiwan will, go back decades and all that progress that will go in vain. So, what your country is doing, in fact, to scale down, or what your country is, in fact, doing that this conflict should not happen, so that all the progress you have made, it should not go in vain.
Yeah, that's right. So this is a big question. I mean, I think Taiwan has suffered, for example, in the past 100 years, there have been, for example, fire bombings during World War II and so forth, that destroyed infrastructure. I think that really today, people that hope for peace would try to avoid that. But in that sense, it is actually an interesting development that, for example, global economic integration is to the degree that China itself is reliant on Taiwan for semiconductors. And so China itself would try to avoid disruption to the infrastructure in Taiwan that its own economy is reliant on, its own supply chains are reliant on. And so I think that's a deterrent to invasion, in fact. And so there have been arguments that this is a deterrent for invasion. This has been termed the Silicon Shield. I don't think it's an absolute argument in the sense that, it's not going to. That's not the reason why China wants Taiwan necessarily. It's not going to stave off the Chinese threat forever. But then You look at the Chinese economy and the Taiwanese economy and how deeply intertwined they are and interconnected they are, and it would be catastrophic for China actually if there were an invasion. And so, for example, could the CCP weather the blow to its legitimacy from not only losing a significant amount of lives to an invasion, a costly invasion, a beachhead invasion that is very logistically difficult, could have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of casualties, but also just the economic blow that would result at a time in which before COVID-19, there's already slowing economic growth and COVID zero and the kind of rolling lockdowns still continue to affect the economy there.
Hmm. So, Mr. Brian, how do you see that these statements come from the peaceful unification talks? The China is talking on that. What is the reaction of the Taiwan and Taiwanese government on that?
So it's actually kind of funny too that there hasn't been a very strong reaction because the comments by Xi are not really anything new. For example, he said that force is still on the table. China hopes for peaceful unification, but if that can happen, force is still on the table. And so he said that before. A few years ago, on the kind of anniversary of this famous letter that was issued to China back in the kind of heyday of communist China, he did actually say that force was on the table, and this was actually more. It was a newer rhetoric at that point in time, so there was a stronger reaction, and the reaction of the Chinese people was actually to rally behind the current leader, Tsai Ing-wen, who saw a uptick in her approval rating after those statements. But that didn't really happen this time because I think it's just nothing new. I think what is interesting is that the international world has sometimes misread Xi's comments as though this does represent an escalation of rhetoric, as though this represents that he's accelerating his timeline for invasion of Taiwan. But he actually, it's just kind of boilerplate. It's not new. It's kind of very standard language, actually.
So, at the end, what we have heard is that many Taiwanese officials are saying that China could threaten a war in 2023 to force the talks. So, do you think that this argument that China can threaten a war so that the Taiwanese government gets ready for the talks with China, do you think that there is some meat in this argument?
It's really hard to say. I mean, I'd be a little careful of some of the statements going around. For example, most recently, there's discussion of that China could invade this year or next year, following comments by Admiral Michael Gilday, who is a Navy general. And so he stated that, for example, needs to be prepared for the possibility of an invasion this year or next year. I mean, this year is impossible. It's physically impossible. It's logistically impossible because they're only 2 months. And so if you're doing an invasion, you need to move the troops into place. It's already too late for that. You need at least a month or two and so forth to get these troops in place. But then next year and so forth, I mean, for example, this is following up on comments by the former head of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Philip Davidson. And recently, Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, also said that he saw an accelerated timeline for China in terms of their ambitions on Taiwan. And so then what happened is the Taiwanese security official, the National Security Bureau head, Chen Ming-tong, said that China could take action in around 2023 to try to bring Taiwan to accept terms set by China. But then he dodged the question of whether that be invasion or another form of action. Because I think that for someone like Chen Ming-tong, he can't really go against what U.S. government officials say because, of course, the U.S. is Taiwan's security guarantor in that case. He doesn't want to openly go against them. But then the ultimate invasion in that short of a timeline, I think, are kind of unlikely because China is still working on its capacities to bring enough troops over to Taiwan to maintain an occupation. What is more realistic and possibly is what Chen Ming-tong is referring to is the possibility of, for example, an intermediate action, attacking an outlying island of Taiwan or gray zone warfare or something of that sort. That's still short of an invasion, but still could be aimed at bringing Taiwan to the negotiating table on Chinese terms. And so that is something that I think that's specifically what he was referring to in that sense.
So we have heard recently that the Americans are in talks with Taiwan to co-produce American weapons. What is the purpose behind of that? Do you think that that is to help to Taiwan to give confidence, to boost the economy, to threaten China? So what do you make of this?
It's a very interesting development because there's strengthening military cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan. For example, regarding the Taiwan Policy Act that was much debated, one of the provisions of that was to create a regional munitions stockpile, which Taiwan could have access to in the event of a conflict. There's always that U.S. arms are sold to Taiwan, but there's kind of a push and pull going on behind the scenes between Taiwan and the U.S. at present regarding, for example, what is the preferred way of staving off China? Is it asymmetric warfare or is it symmetric warfare? Is it traditional forms of warfare, tanks and that kind of thing, or is it asymmetric means that are intended to hold off China in that sense, using less force? And so these are better for different kinds of operations. For example, deterring an invasion versus deterring gray zone warfare, or for example, waiting for another power in the region to intervene, whether that is the U.S. or Japan or whatever, or holding it off yourself indefinitely. And so there's kind of push and pull, but perhaps what cooperation is intended to suggest is that there's ways to work on it together, and that maybe this allows for more negotiation or compromise or discussion. I think in general, then there's also critiques in Taiwan of, for example, the U.S. selling arms to Taiwan, but then they're not necessarily what Taiwan itself uses defense needs as necessary for its defense. But then the U.S. will think that Taiwan has needs that it tries to kind of position what arms it sells to Taiwan based on its own assessment of Taiwan's needs. And so there's kind of this kind of disagreements there. So I think cooperation could perhaps help with that.
So, with all that developments going on, how much there is a support of the Chinese Taiwanese people with the Taiwanese government, and what kind of thoughts, issues the Taiwanese people face when they face that the war is looming around them?
So it's actually very interesting because a lot of this kind of military exercise and so forth doesn't have a large reaction among the population because of the fact that there have been decades of this. People are kind of inured to it. They're quite used to it. And so even with the missile that was fired over Taipei, I mean, that's very new. That's never happened before. Or these live fire drills that are so close to Taiwan. This did not actually lead to a strong reaction. So I think it's one of the interesting aspect of it. There is a sense of crisis, for example, regarding Hong Kong or Ukraine when these events outside of Taiwan occur that Taiwan can project its anxieties onto. And during elections, there is kind of a sense of crisis regarding who do you vote for and what Taiwan's future will be and how does whoever rules the country deal with China. But then with regards to these live fire drills, that didn't lead to a reaction. I think part of it is actually that China, in terms of their messaging, has been too repetitive. For example, sending planes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone daily. People don't pay attention to the number of planes, whether it's 10 or 20 or 30. It doesn't create a sense of escalation. It becomes a kind of repetitive news story that, oh, more planes from China. And so I think that's part of the reason why. But life goes on, and people are actually focused much more on the domestic elections, the midterm elections, which are set to take place on November 26th.
So, Brian, taking the discussion to the region, how do you see how the regional countries are responding to this Chinese aggression on Taiwan? How do you see that, for instance, Japan, Thailand, and other countries, even India, and how these countries respond to this Chinese aggression on Taiwan?
Yeah, so I think that's an increasing question going forward, how other countries respond. Japan is the one that is talked about the most within Taiwan because historic relations between Taiwan and Japan. Taiwan was formerly colonized by Japan, but the ruling Democratic Party, the Progressive Party, enjoys close ties with Japan. And so, for example, you did have the Vice President, William Lai, visiting Japan for the funeral of Shinzo Abe, the assassinated Japanese Prime Minister. You have seen Japanese delegations visiting Taiwan recently. There's talks of, for example, increased cooperation, maritime cooperation, that kind of thing. That idea is floated periodically. Because Japan is actually, for example, Okinawa, regardless of the U.S. troops there, it is Japanese territory, and it is actually closer to Taiwan than it's the rest of the Japanese archipelago. And so Japan would actually be quite nervous in the event of an invasion of Taiwan. And so I think Japan is obligated to respond in that sense. But then it also is a question then what other countries in the region respond. I mean, Taiwan has not focused as much outreach militarily or geostrategically regarding Southeast Asia, which I think is unfortunate. I mean, there's a lot of talk of building a stronger, for example, economic cooperation with Southeast Asia through the New Southbound policy to reduce dependency, over-dependency of the economy on China. But then in terms of this kind of geostrategic cooperation, it's a little difficult. I mean, particularly there are a lot of Southeast Asian countries that are ruled by military regimes that are close to China and would be more aligned in terms of values, let's say, with China. But then in terms of, for example, Australia, that's another factor. For example, Australia has now signed this nuclear sub-deal with the US and the UK and so forth, AUKUS. And there's a debate about the Chinese influence within the country. How does Australia position itself in that? I mean, there's a recent statement by a former prime minister of Australia dismissing Taiwan as a concern entirely, and that was criticized by in some circles, but that does reflect some views. And so I think that's kind of another uncertain value. But I think then Taiwan has historically focused its outreach on a very limited set of countries. And I think that's its own detriment, particularly focusing on the US and putting all of its eggs in one basket there. And so I think there needs to be more consideration of, for example, Southeast Asian countries.
So, Brian, one last question from you.
Mhm.
During all these tensions, how do you see that the Taiwan's defense budget has increased, decreased, or it's freezing?
Yeah, I mean, there's calls to increase the budget, and this is something the U.S. has wanted for a long time for Taiwan. The U.S. has also wanted Taiwan to lengthen the mandatory military draft for male members of the population to 1 year. It is currently 4 months, because you can't actually learn that much in 4 months. And so there's that. Now it's basically now or never regarding some of these military reform efforts, because this is the time in which you do have to take steps, and you do have the political mandate to take steps. But particularly for the DPP, or the ruling DPP, the party that's currently in power, it might be a electorally unpopular move because people don't actually want to fight in the army and etc. Or they don't necessarily want more budget going to the military, because the perception that this is actually what raises the odds of conflict, and so people are conflict averse in that sense. But then that might prevent these steps for taking military readiness to prevent conflict from actually breaking out in that sense.
Yes, there's this is a very complex situation which is in the region, and there's so many questions around us. Thank you very much, Brian, for your time and speaking for my channel. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.